has been brought to you by the letter I.
Alright, so today we're going to discuss something a little bit different, and that would be indigenous archaeology. So I is for indigenous archaeology. Okay, so...
what is indigenous?
It means originating or occurring naturally in a particular place.
Sure, but it's not as simple as it sounds. So, for example, Britain. Who are the indigenous people of Britain? If you look at ancient DNA, we know for sure that there were times where there were people here, genetically a people, who disappeared. We don't know how. There were times when a new group of people came in and merged with the old group. So who really are the indigenous people here? Well, if we look in the real world, how the word indigenous is used, it sort of means the existing people, so people who are still around today, and by people we mean culturally and genetically, who have been in a place for the longest of any existing people. So, for example, going back to Britain, I guess that would be like the Welsh and the Scottish. Sorry, England. Okay. Let's move on to a short history lesson. So as I've mentioned previously on this show, the birth of archaeology as a discipline was very much intertwined with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. During this time, people no longer felt like they automatically owed fealty to a king or queen, so they needed some larger idea to sort of tie them down to a country, the idea of a nation state. Because, quite frankly, the idea that God-given authority was good enough, that wasn't working out so well.
Your Majesty, you're next. Do you require a blindfold?
None.
Have you any last words?
None.
Test the guillotine!
Holy!
And at the same time, it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and technology and science and the idea of progress was really getting underway. It was becoming like a secular religion. You had railroads springing up all over the place, and Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution in the book On the Origin of Species in 1859. So a lot of these trends were coming together. And soon we were off to the races, and a monk named Gregor Mendel got into genetics with his famous pea plant experiments in the middle of the century. But that also led to some really bad stuff like racial pseudoscience. The idea that people were different, and that had some scientific basis, and we had to prove that to show who was in the nation, who was out of the nation, who was better one versus the other. Things like phrenology or craniology to try to establish different levels of intelligence and based on the brain size and the skull shape of different people. Weird stuff. And the idea was that that archaeology could help prove and find differences in people over time, and also find that people belonged in a certain place over time. So that gave them the claim to the land, hence the nation. A group of people, all similar as established by science, had their deep roots in this place, so it belonged to them, it was their country. And that's the direction archaeology was going in. So from the 1800s until World War II...
it got weird, didn't it?
Yeah, it got weird. So, because archaeology, so much of it was bent towards the justification of the nation, and as we know, European nations were also very interested in justifying their control over other nations via imperialism and colonialization, that became a big project in archaeology too, to justify that. So we had European colonialists going all over the world, collecting people's stuff, and displaying it and erecting it in their own cities all over Europe, or selling it to those enterprising Americans. And therefore, what was left in the colonies? Well, in many places, not much, or at least not much that was shiny or made of stone. You see, the archaeologists in this time, they quite frankly, like everyone else, lived in the racist context of the time. Now, to give them a little bit of credit, a lot of them genuinely were respectful and interested in the cultures that they were encountering all over the world. but it was all through the racial lens of the time. And also some other non-racial just prejudices, like a bias towards riches and monumental architecture, for example. So for instance, in a lot of Africa, colonial archaeologists and anthropologists and ethnographers built museums that focused a lot on the origins of humanity in Africa. But they kind of left everything else out, implying that after about 100,000 years ago, there was nothing much worth studying in Africa. And in places like the US, you often had exhibitions about indigenous people in natural history museums, where many of them are today, alongside things like animals, dinosaurs, and rocks. And they also came up with crazy ideas, like the idea that the archaeological site at Great Zimbabwe was built by some Phoenicians that went from the Mediterranean all the way down to southern Africa like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, because, you know, those savage people down there couldn't have built those great stone buildings.
Are you stupid or something?
And fun fact, Zimbabwe is the only country in the world that is named after an archaeological site. And that little bird on the flag, that actually was an artifact found on site. So fast forward to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and you have the end of colonialism, decolonization, and suddenly you have the rise of mass movements advocating for the rights of indigenous people and the end of neo-colonialism, and suddenly things really start to change. And this applies both to former colonies, so whole countries, and to populations of indigenous people within countries, domestic populations. People are demanding their right to tell their own stories. So you have the rise of the repatriation movement, which was helped along the way by official acts and laws and conventions like NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, passed by the US Congress in 1990, and the UN General Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. Beyond repatriation, this means getting indigenous and local people involved in the actual archaeology, the digging. So you have Indians digging Indian stuff, Egyptians digging Egyptian stuff, indigenous people in the United States, Native Americans digging Native American stuff. And even when you have European or foreign archaeologists who are leading a certain archaeological excavation, they'll now usually have co-leads that are local people or local people on their teams, or they'll lead the project for the first couple of seasons and then hand it over to a locally led team. So you have a lot more of the archaeology being done by people who reflect the indigenous and local populations. And finally, this also means incorporating indigenous voices and perspectives into the interpretation and the storytelling, which is, the most important part. So this is why, for example, in a lot of museums in North America, you'll see sort of two information panels or one information panel with two sides in front of something. You'll see one bit, which is sort of the dry, scientific, boring part, and then you'll see like the Native American interpretation on the other side. It's incorporating that Native American voice into the presentation of the display. So that's progress, right? Inclusion, it's all good. Yes, but it isn't totally without problems. First, it's not like all indigenous people believe and interpret things the same way. It's also often that there's not only one indigenous group, and indigenous people can play the same kind of shenanigans that anyone else can play. So for example, that site I mentioned, Great Zimbabwe, well, if you know about Zimbabwe, after the end of colonialism there, it was ruled by a brutal dictator named Robert Mugabe. So when Zimbabwe took control of the site and invested in sort of presenting it and interpreting it, Mugabe had the story of that site really favor his own group, the Shona, which is his own indigenous group. But guess what? There were other indigenous groups. But because he was the big dear leader, he made the story sort of tie his own people more to the site in the history, to the exclusion of others. Second, it's an open question just how far this should go. For example, let's say there was some indigenous artifact that was radiocarbon dated to 600 years old. So that's a pretty rock-solid scientific technique. But let's say for said indigenous group, that artifact was part of some myth that went back 20,000 years. Do you think that in the museum they should present it equally, that it could be 600 years old or 20,000 years old, and just sort of let the viewer decide? Well, if you answered yes, just check yourself and see if you would extend that same courtesy to a more dominant narrative, like, let's say, Christianity. Now, if you've been to churches all over the world, you know a lot of them have, like, random bits of wood that they say are part of the original cross, or bits of fingernails and bones that they say are holy relics from saints. Would you be okay with those being presented in museums as the holy bones of saints, or just some random bone that was radiocarbon dated to 100 years ago, and just sort of allow them both to stand on equal footing? That's really the question. Or how about the Shroud of Turin, which is located in a cathedral in Turin in northern Italy, where they had the Olympics a couple decades ago? Now, that bears the imprint of a man, which is supposedly Christ, because it's supposedly the shroud that he was wrapped in when he died. Now, I've seen the thing a few times, and you can see the imprint of a man there. Well, that was radiocarbon dated to, I believe, 1260 to 1390, a long time after Jesus died. And yet it is the traditional Christian understanding that that is the image of Jesus in there. Well, we know scientifically that that doesn't pan out. So would you be okay with that being in a museum and being presented as, you know, it could be the image of Christ or maybe not, you decide. So it's an open question. But I think overall what we can say is indigenous archaeology is definitely a good thing, as it promotes inclusivity and gives people a say in the narrative of their own story. So it definitely does help with the pluralism of the whole discipline. All right, so that's I for indigenous archaeology. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.